World Empires Series Part 8, The Medieval World Chapters, 4754–700–1300 AD Introduction. The ancient world is behind us. Rome has transformed. Islam has arrived. Byzantine Christianity holds the East. Latin Christianity rebuilds the West. We enter now the world that history books used to call the Dark Ages, a term that is deeply misleading and which modern historians have largely abandoned. This was not a dark age. It was an age of extraordinary complexity, creativity, and violence. It was the world of Charlemagne, of the Crusades, of soaring cathedrals, and of an Islamic civilization that was, for 5 centuries, the most intellectually advanced on earth. Chapter 47, Charlemagne and the Carolingian Empire on Christmas Day, 800 AD in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Pope Leo III placed a crown on the head of the Frankish King Charles and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The crowd shouted their approval. Charles, known to history as Charlemagne, Charles the Great, reportedly said he had not wanted it. Historians have debated this claim for 12 centuries. What is not debated is the significance of the moment. For the first time since 476 AD, there was an emperor in the West. The coronation created a precedent that a Western ruler's legitimacy required papal blessing that would define European politics for the next 700 years and produce centuries of conflict between popes and emperors. Charlemagne was a man of contradictions. He could barely write. His biographer Einhard tells us he kept writing tablets under his pillow so he could practice at night, never managing to master the art. Yet he championed literacy, founding palace schools, standardizing the Latin script, and gathering the finest scholars of the age at his court in Aachen. He united more of Western Europe under a single ruler than anyone since Augustus. His empire did not survive him intact. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 AD, signed by his grandsons, divided the Carolingian territories into 3 kingdoms that became roughly the forerunners of France, Germany, and a middle strip that has been contested ever since. But the idea of a united Christian Europe, the idea that would animate the Crusades, the Holy Roman Empire, and eventually the European Union, was born in Charlemagne's court. Chapter 48, Feudalism and the Medieval Order. How did medieval Europe organize itself? The answer is feudalism, a system of mutual obligation and hierarchy that structured society from the king down to the poorest serf. At the top, the king granted land, called fiefs, to his great nobles, the dukes, earls, and barons who formed his military backbone. In return, they swore loyalty and provided knights for military service. Those nobles in turn granted land to knights who owed military service. At the bottom, the vast mass of the population, peasants and serfs, worked the land in exchange for protection. Serfs were legally bound to their lord's land. They could not leave without permission. The church sat across this entire structure at every level. Bishops and abbots held vast territories. Church courts ran parallel to royal courts. The clergy were the educated class. Almost everyone who could read or write was in holy orders. And the constant tension between ecclesiastical authority and royal power, between pope and emperor, was one of the defining political dramas of the medieval period. Medieval life was dominated by agriculture, the liturgical calendar, and the physical presence of death. Life expectancy was short, infant mortality staggering. But it was also a world of genuine faith, community, and, despite the stereotype, a significant intellectual vitality. Chapter 49, The Great Schism of 1054. In July 1054, Cardinal Humbert of Rome placed a bull of excommunication on the altar of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Patriarch Michael Cerularius responded by excommunicating the papal legates in return. The mutual excommunications that were issued that summer, and which stood until 1964, marked the formal split between Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. The split had been building for centuries. Theological disputes, particularly over the Filioque, the Western addition to the Creed stating that the Holy Spirit proceeds from both Father and Son, not just the Father, combined with questions of papal authority and differing liturgical practices to create an unbridgeable gulf. Rome claimed the Pope as supreme head of all Christians. Constantinople insisted that the Patriarch of Constantinople was first among equals, not subordinate to Rome. The consequences were enormous. Eastern Orthodoxy would go on to shape the religious culture of Greece, Russia, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Georgia. Roman Catholicism would dominate Western and Central Europe. And the two traditions, which share the same creeds and the same core theology, would regard each other with a mixture of recognition and suspicion that has never entirely been resolved. Chapters 50 through 52. The Crusades. On a cold November day in 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a great crowd at Clermont in France and called on the Knights of Europe to march to Jerusalem. The city was in the hands of the Seljuk Turks, who had been blocking Christian pilgrims. The Byzantine emperor had asked for help. Urban seized the moment. God wills it. The crowd reportedly cried, Deus lo vult. And the First Crusade was born. What followed over the next 2 centuries was one of the most complex and bloody chapters in the history of the relationship between Christianity and Islam. The First Crusade succeeded. Jerusalem was taken in 1099, at the cost of a massacre of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants that horrified even contemporary observers. Crusader states were established in the Holy Land. But they were always precarious outposts, dependent on constant reinforcement from Europe. The Crusades were not a single phenomenon, but a series of very different enterprises. The Third Crusade, featuring Richard I of England and Saladin in an epic contest, ended with Richard controlling the coastal cities but not Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade, the most scandalous, ended with Crusaders sacking Constantinople, the great Christian city, and establishing a Latin empire there. The betrayal deepened Catholic Orthodox hostility for centuries. Saladin, the Kurdish general who united Egypt and Syria and retook Jerusalem in 1187, treated the defeated Christian population with notable mercy, in pointed contrast to the 1099 massacre. His behavior became a model of Islamic chivalry celebrated by Muslim historians, and his reputation impressed even his enemies. The last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land fell to the Mamluks in 1291. The age of crusading armies was effectively over. Chapter 53. Islam's Golden Age. While Europe was building castles and fighting crusades, the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, was presiding over one of the most remarkable intellectual civilizations in human history. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, founded around 830 AD, was part library, part translation bureau, part research institution. Scholars translated Greek texts, Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Galen, Ptolemy, into Arabic. Then they improved on them. Al-Khwarizmi invented algebra. The word itself comes from his book title, Kitab al-Jabr. Arabic numerals, including 0, transmitted from India through Islamic scholars, replaced the cumbersome Roman numerals across the world. Ibn al-Haytham revolutionized optics, demonstrating that light enters the eye rather than emanating from it. Ibn Sina, Avicenna to the Latin West, wrote the Canon of Medicine, which remained the standard medical textbook in European universities for 6 centuries. When the Mongols destroyed Baghdad in 1258, burning the House of Wisdom, and reportedly turning the Tigris River black with the ink of the drowned manuscripts, it was a blow from which the Abbasid world never fully recovered. But the knowledge survived in the translations that had been carried to Spain, Sicily, and the rest of the Islamic world, and in the Latin translations that European scholars had been making for a century. The rediscovery of Aristotle through Arabic translations directly sparked the medieval scholastic movement and the thought of Thomas Aquinas. End of Part 8.